Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Director General National Museum, Madam Lili Pandya, I welcome you all to the National Museum and also to the monthly NM Public Lecture Series. Today's lecture is quite special, and so is the occasion. As you're aware that we are hosting a beautiful exhibition showcasing the textile traditions of India and also the craftsmanship. It is in collaboration with the Baldota Foundation. The foundation is headed by Madam Lavina Baldota, and I'm so happy to see her here today. So thank you, ma'am, for your presence. When I say happy, it is just not limited to the exhibition, but also to your presence. Because had it not been for your participation, for your reels, for your Object of the Day series, must-see objects and all that, concerning this exhibition, I don't think this exhibition would have reached different parts of the country, because we have had participants from Northeast, visitors from Northeast, NGOs visiting the exhibition, and most importantly, for a museum, the most important fact is that when you get repeat visitors. So I'm aware that there are visitors in the museum, in the audience today, who have visited the exhibition not just once, twice, but on multiple occasions. So a heartfelt thank you and gratitude to you towards, from our side and also from Baldota Foundation for your participation and for making this exhibition a success, because we have increased the visitor footfall. So thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am, for choosing National Museum as your venue to host this exhibition. It has indeed increased our visitor footfall. So thank you very much. But like every good thing that has to come to an end, so is this exhibition. It concludes today, but we thought what better way to conclude this exhibition than take you on a journey exploring the length and breadth of our country by celebrating the magic called textiles. अब हम जब magic की बात करें और magician का reference ना हो, then I think it will be unfair on my part. So today's magician, who would be taking us on a journey sailing through different parts of the country, is Mr. Mayank Mansingh Kaul. He is a reputed textile designer, and I would request my colleague, Dr. Abira Bhattacharya, who heads the anthropology department, to kindly facilitate our speaker with a floral bouquet. Thank you very much, Abira. Before I invite our speaker to join me on the dais, I think it is important for me to speak a little bit about his body of work. Of course, he does not need anyone's introduction, but I think it's my duty to speak a little bit about his achievements. Our speaker is a renowned textile designer, which I've already mentioned, but he wears many hats. He is a prolific writer, a distinguished curator. Mr. Kaul is a graduate in textile design from the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad. He is the founder director of the Design Project, a not-for-profit organization. He is best known for his work documenting the histories of textiles, design, fashion and trends in post-independence India. He is a consulting editor with Architectural Digest India and a member of the Advisory Council on Arts and Culture at the Asia Society. And interestingly, Mr. Kaul, while still a student of NID, he worked as a consultant with the Planning Commission of India's Task Force on Cultural and Creative Policy. Besides being a distinguished textile designer, he is extensively involved in writing, curatorial assignments, and archiving projects related to Indian designs. He was also guest editor for reputed publication houses, including Take on Art Design and Mark Publication on contemporary histories of textile in India. As far as his curatorial contributions concerned, his exhibition repertoire is exhaustive, and I don't think I would do justice talking about all of them, but if I may, I would like to mention about a few, please. The idea of fashion, which was held in New Delhi in the year 2011 at Khoj International Artist Residency. He has also exhibited at the Devi Art Foundation in 2015 Fracture Indian Textiles New Conversations. Gold, the art of Zari, I beg your pardon, at Bikaner House in the year 2017. Crossroads Textile Journey with Ritu Kumar at India Habitat Center in 2018. Meanings, Metaphor, Handspun and Handwoven in the year 2019 at Bangalore. And of course, the ongoing exhibition Sutra Santati, where he has contributed in diverse ways. So, without further ado, I would invite a speaker to take us on a journey exploring the beautiful textiles that we see across India and much more. Please.
Should I stand like this or? Thank you so much. Gosh, I feel good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for a warm welcome. Gay and the team at the National Museum. It's great to see so many of you turn up for a lecture, even though it does put a lot of pressure on me because it's a Saturday afternoon. I'm sure all of you have had a big lazy lunch. So I'm going to try and make it worth the while. While Rige was introducing me, I really felt like an object, like a textile object from the National Museum because she dug out stuff on me that even I had forgotten. It was so far back. But means a lot to be invited to the National Museum, an institution that I myself grew up visiting so often, seeing some wonderful exhibitions not only on textiles but on other aspects of Indian history and culture and art. And especially honored to be here on the closing day of Sutra Santati, a fantastic exhibition which celebrates 75 years of India's independence through its diverse textiles. We thought on this occasion it may be good to, since most of the textiles, I hope most of you have seen this exhibition, there will be a walkthrough after this lecture of the exhibition with Lavina ji and myself, so please feel free to join us for that. But we felt that since the objects and the textiles which have been exhibited in the exhibition reflect so much of where Indian handmade textiles are today, it's a true reflection of the aesthetics, materials, the ways in which craftspeople, designers, artists are expressing themselves, that it may also be good to reflect on the last 75 years. So the presentation really looks at an overview of important developments, the evolution of certain kinds of aesthetics in handmade textiles, and I'll be mentioning a few individuals who I feel have been important in shaping this post-independence trajectory. Of course, being so vast as a country with so many geographical regions with such diversity of handmade textile traditions, one can never really be comprehensive. And one is always bound to miss out on things. One can never truly represent the great diversity that Indian textiles represents, especially through the last 75 years. But what I've chosen are just a few snippets, a few moments that I think are important to sort of pause and reflect on. And like I shared earlier, which I think have really helped push sort of India's evolution of handmade textiles from point one to point B, So to begin with, if I may please have the first slide, thank you so much. I feel this is an image that very interestingly sums up two aesthetic streams that India inherits in the 1940s and 50s, immediately after its independence from British colonial rule. On one hand, you have the Gandhian legacy. The huge importance of handlooms, Swadeshi, handspun and handwoven cloth in unifying the country, in actually giving it a certain kind of identity through its sartorial culture, in using the power of the handmade and village industries And that is something that continues to be important in India today. So I feel like this image captures that one aesthetic stream, which continues to be very relevant. The other is that of international modernism. So this is actually an image by French photographer Manuel Bugo, who photographed the interiors of the Legislative Assembly in Chandigarh, which was designed by Corbusier, the famous Swiss architect, who designed the city of Chandigarh in the 50s. And what you see behind the frame picture of Gandhi in the Legislative Assembly is actually tapestries that Corbusier himself designed, which were woven by Panjadari weavers of Punjab in the 1950s. And they can be considered to be among the most exceptional of modern tapestries in the world. You can only imagine the scale. You can see the benches. So you can only imagine the scale of these hand-woven tapestries that were produced. It is recorded that Corbusier also understood and read about Indian mythology, brought up aspects of India's history, symbolism, and used that, in this case, various symbols, abstract symbols in the design of these tapestries. So you have on the one hand, India inheriting the Swadeshi, craft-based, village industries kind of ethos. And on the other hand, this idea of global international modernism, which was current in the world and in many ways was giving way to a new generation of design, a new way of life. In Europe, for instance, in the post-World War scenario, this kind of international modernism acquired a completely different new height. So India was sort of straddling these two worlds, one which had to address its own internal resurrection of its village industries, which had been devastated through colonial rule, and at the same time, the need to be a part of an international conversation. If we may have the next slide, please. In the early decades of India's independence, for the lack of other kinds of patronage available in the country, private enterprise was fledgling, it was only just beginning. The central government of India became the biggest patron for handmade textiles, for craft, and a host of other kinds of creative industries in the country. And this took the form of institutions that were set up, like the All India Handicrafts Board, the All India Handlooms Board, the Handloom and Handicrafts Export Corporation of India, or the HHEC, the Cottage Industries Corporation of India, as well as the Weaver Service Centers, which even today exist across the country. I think there are about 29 or 30 of them. And two individuals, the freedom fighter Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay and the aesthete writer Upul Jaikar, became very, very involved in leading these institutions, providing state support. Some of the earliest interventions in the 1950s were in handloom centers that had seen complete devastation. So I'm showing you an image of a revival of the Bengal Baluchari Saree, but in Banaras in the 1950s. So since the early 1900s, the Baluchari, the famed silk brocade textiles, sarees of Baluchar, had actually not been produced at the level of their historical masterpieces. And post-independence, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay led a revival effort along with historian Jasleen Dhamija, and explored, because the tools, the infrastructure, the technical know-how, as well as the willingness of the weavers in Bengal had really dipped by then in Bishnupur, in the area around where Baluchari was historically produced. They felt that perhaps because it was a silk textile, it could be taken to Banaras and reproduced. So they counted on an expert and very, very versatile master weaver, fondly known as Kalu Hafiz or Ali Hassan. And this is one of the earliest reproductions or revival pieces of the Baluchari in Banaras, which gave rise to a completely new tradition. So one of the important things to keep in mind through the presentation and consistently for us when we understand contemporary and modern histories of India is that so much that we take for granted today, so much that we think is actually really old, is a part of these kinds of new traditions that were consciously intervened with, that were generated in the immediate decades of post-independence India. May I have the next slide, please? Down south, the danseuse and Bharatanatyam exponent Rukmini Arundale had started, as part of the Theosophical movement, an international arts academy an institution that we all today know of as Kalakshetra. It was started in 1936, and within a year of the establishment of Kalakshetra, she also set up a handloom workshop to produce saris, to actually revive Indian aesthetics in saris that she felt were sort of disintegrating because of the colonial and westernized influence on the sari. So in 1937, you have the birth of the Kalakshetra workshop. And for many years, for almost half a century, we've had this understanding that actually it was the neighboring town of Kanchipuram to Madras where Kalakshetra was set up, which influenced the Kalakshetra sari. But we now have increasing evidence that it was actually the design that Rukmini Devi gave to the sari in Kalakshetra that in turn influenced a new tradition of silk saris that we know today of as the Kanjivaram in the historically important temple town and hand weaving center of Kanchipuram. So just to give you a sense of what was happening down south, if we have the next slide please. In 1949, within 2 years of India's independence, was established what remains even today as the only dedicated museum for historical Indian textiles, the Calico Museum of Textiles in Ahmedabad. It was started by Gira and Gautam Sarabhai from an industrialist family that actually had made their fortunes through the colonial period in mill production, in min-made cloth. And it was insisted that by a very well-known South Asian art historian, Anand Kumaraswamy, he insisted that the Sarabhais, use some of the profits from the mill sector to actually invest in a museum, and thus the Calico Museum was born. The Calico Museum stands today with an extraordinary collection of historical Indian textiles of all genres, and having produced dozens of publications on its collections can also be seen as perhaps a very important series of consistent publications which offer, in the lack of a history of Indian textile program in the country, a pedagogy or a series of textbooks on Indian textile history as well. So here you see one of the galleries at the Calico Museum. The image is taken from one of Calico Museum's publications, Experiencing a Museum, with photographs by Dashrath Patel and an introductory essay by B.N. Goswami. May we have the next slide, please? So what was happening was that while the central government was patronizing, was encouraging the establishment of the institutions, processes and interventions that I earlier spoke of, the states were also finding the identity of their own. Gujarat was one such state, so therefore state emporia. Many of you may be familiar with the state emporia row just off Connaught Place in Baba Khadak Singh Marg. So this was also a time that state governments started processes of textile revival, setting up emporia, setting up systems of producing product for the new market, asking questions of how to contemporize, how to make relevant traditions, for a new country, for a new sort of Indian middle class and so on and so forth. And Gurjari in Gujarat was one such early experiment which became very, very successful. This image is of Mr. Brij Bhasin, who was the head of Gurjari and actually led that entire phase when Gurjari became very, very successful. And I think this is an image that he had shared with us a while back for a publication I edited on the opening of Gurjari's Ahmedabad store. Can we have the next slide? So while all of these sort of state and central government institutions, you have a slow occurrence of a museum in the private sector through Calico, we also started seeing the slow rise of the private sector. So in Delhi itself, in the diplomatic area of Chanakyapuri, a designer called Sunaina Suneja set up set up a small boutique called Raj's Creations, which started working with Indian handlooms, started contemporizing them, providing a kind of Western silhouette, Indo-Western garments, experimenting with those kinds of styles. This is an archival image of one of the fashion shows that Raj Sunaina had organized. She used to regularly organize fashion shows. This was the 60s. There was a new sort of generation of expatriates in India diplomats who would come from all over the world and were also discovering what this country was all about at that point. So this is an image from one of the fashion shows that Raj Sunena organized in the American Embassy in the 60s, giving us a sense of also how the high-end boutique culture was slowly slowly finding a feet, which today has developed into the huge Indian fashion industry that we know of. Some of the individuals, aside from those associated with the government who became relevant during this time, I'm going to discuss some of those individuals. One of them was Nelly Sechna, a very well-known textile artist and educator, who herself had trained in America, in the United States, in a very small weaving workshop academy studio a school called the Cranbrook Academy. And she was from Bombay, she came back to India and actually helped set up the handloom unit, the handloom workshop at the National Institute of Design, which was also set up in the early 1960s by the government of India. And what is interesting is that you had this kind of movement of artists and designers who had studied abroad, were coming back to the country, and would go in search of documenting of India's living traditions of textiles. And actually, she wrote a number of books on the kalamkari. And this is a cover of one of the publications that she authored. And it's so interesting because she looked at kalamkari as a combination of hand-painted and block-printed textiles. Today, we think of kalamkari and define it as textiles which are only hand-painted. But historically, they were juxtaposed. These techniques were juxtaposed. And it was actually a suggestion that was made by scholar Bessie Cecil from Chennai, that she actually gave the term kalamkari. So why I bring this here is also that, just to add to my earlier suggestion, that so many of these kinds of traditions were being born afresh in post-independence India, new vocabularies were also being created. So actually, when we went in search of the word kalamkari, we found that, which we take so much for granted today, we find that the word kalamkar appears, but we don't actually have the word kalamkari because the textiles that the technique produced was exported to Japan. Historically, it was called sarissa. When it was exported to Britain and France, it was called the Tree of Life or Palampur, and so on and so forth. So it was actually Nelly Sechna who also came up with this vocabulary for the kalamkari. Can we have the next slide, please? And we know that publications like Marg, which were also born at the time of India's independence, 1946, continues to be a very important arts and culture journal in the country, picks up this word kalamkari and then starts using it. So it's interesting how some of these words actually get invented in the post-independence period, and we use them now to attribute a huge history, often, hundreds and thousands of years, but that this vocabulary was also sort of taking shape in this country at that point, and the ways in which these vocabularies were actually taking shape. Nelly Sechna developed an independent practice as a textile artist. She was a weaver, and she developed an absolutely outstanding range of textiles which she produced. She also taught at the Sophia Polytechnic. She taught weaving in the textile department at the Sophia Polytechnic in Bombay. So with NID, with the Sophia Polytechnic, with some of these educational institutions, you also have the birth of design pedagogy, you have the birth of textile curriculum for design, which then sort of gets taken up, across decades as the sort of the seed of textile education in this country. This is a large tapestry that I had the opportunity to show at an exhibition I curated in Jaipur. I don't know how many of you actually grew up in India in the 80s, but this idea of the wall textile, the wall tapestry, which you found in several shops at that point, and it suggested that actually Nelly Sechna sort of devised this kind of unique wall art idea for India, which became very popular across middle class India, in the 70s and 80s. So it's interesting to see how sometimes the work of an individual then gets sort of amplified through retail, through opportunities that develop for marketing, for sales. And it's interesting to see how these kinds of dynamics also sort of take place. May we have the next slide, please? Another very, very important and interesting textile artist, contemporary artist, was Ritu Kumar. He was trained in Shanti Niketan. He then went on to work with some print companies in Sweden, and he then came back to India and started designing some of the earliest textile products for Fab India. At that time, Fab India in the 60s was a very small company set up by an Indophile, the American John Bissell, and it was producing primarily for export. And Ritu became involved in some of its earliest designs, which continued for several decades right up to the 90s. This is an image. He at the same time had an independent practice as an artist, had his own studio. And this particular textile is actually taken from a home in Sri Lanka, because he was also producing for architects and interior designers both in India as well as outside of the country. He used a lot of hand painting techniques, he used block printing, and straddled this kind of world of producing for a brand like Fab India. He had his own company where he was producing garments for export using block printing, but at the same time sort of keeping up an independent artistic practice of his own. Another such individual who was actually very involved in the birth of Fab India as a designer was Surya Hassan Bose. She passed away just a year back and was a freedom fighter. She was based in Hyderabad, and she started producing daris for Fab India in the 1960s, which were then exported by Fab India, and eventually started working on reviving many of the historical Dakhani traditions of textiles, such as Himru and Mashru and so on, and Kalamkari and so on and so forth. If we have the next slide, please. So this is an image of one of the Himru designs that she revived. She set up a small workshop. She at some point had a huge business. She was working with a lot of textile techniques and producers across Andhra Pradesh. And in later years, sort of scaled that down into a very small studio where I said she was producing Mashru and Himru, very specialized products. And this is one of the historical Himru pieces that she also revived. May we have the next slide, please? So while Fab India became sort of this kind of name from the 60s to 80s, that was defining this kind of new contemporary aesthetic for a urban Indian middle class. You also had brands like Anokhi, which set up shop. This was a phase where a lot of handmade textiles were produced for export. This was a time that India was rediscovered for its block printing, for its hand painted textiles, for the kind of living traditions it had and started being incorporated into Western collections of garments. So Anokhi was another very important. Both Fab India and Anokhi today are huge companies. Most of you may have heard about them, visited their stores, but they all had very nascent beginnings and started expressing an idea of an Indian contemporary, both for the local market as well as for the international market. Another very important person who now who establishes a presence at this point, first through the export route in setting up an export house, is a famous Indian designer, Ritu Kumar. So beginning with working with interesting block printing, devising her own designs for textiles, she then became perhaps India's first, post-independence fashion designer, setting up a huge company that continues to have a very large retail presence in the country today, while also having a strong export business. So what was interesting about Ritu Kumar was also that she was at every juncture of India's sort of cultural evolution. She was there to sort of understand how she could be relevant, how the brand could be relevant to that phase in India's growth. So in the early 90s, when the markets opened up, post-liberalization, when the beauty market, cable television started, becoming very important, she also used all of these opportunities and platforms to propel her business and brand into a very, very big all India and international name. A very unique experiment that she's always going to be known for was the association she had with Indian beauty queens. So Miss India pageants, Miss World pageants, all of these suddenly became very important in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. And she was dressing a lot of supermodels, a lot of these pageant contestants and winners. So you see Sushmita Sen, who won the Miss Universe title in 1994 in one of Ritu Kumar's revival ensembles using chikankari and Indian embroidery, and a very, very interesting archival image from Ritu Kumar's brand history. Another designer who emerges during this time is Shah Mahuja. Today he's a well-known name. Because I spoke so much about people who are working in the apparel space, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about Shah Mahuja, who starts working with traditional Indian dharis and gives it a certain kind of international appeal. And by the 80s and 90s, he became a huge international name, exporting to the best interior projects around the country, setting up shops and viewing rooms abroad. So Shah Mahuja continues to be a very important name in this history of post-independence textiles that we talk about. Also sort of, at a time that India was still known to be third world, at a time that India was still known to be sort of struggling with its own issues, emerging out of the post-colonial experience, to actually give the Made in India tag, this kind of, which even today brands in India struggle to do internationally, to position this kind of Made in India tag at a global level, and to be recognized for its designed in India sort of value, was something that Shah Mahuja really pioneered and will always be remembered for. I spoke very briefly about the National Institute of Design, which was set up in the early 1960s, and it's interesting because in the 1960s, when NID was set up, it was based on certain recommendations to the government of India by American designers Charles and Ray Eames. And its product design sort of department looked to the Bauhaus design and art movement in Germany as a way to sort of find a common relevance between post-war Europe and post-colonial India. Its graphic design and visual communication department and curriculum and program was inspired by the Swiss Basel School of Graphic Design. So NID was looking at all of these international references as a way to sort of begin a conversation to introduce these currents of global occurrences in the Indian context. And for its textile design department, it invited a Finnish designer who had worked with the famous print company Marimekko to actually come to India and set up and establish its textile design department. Helena Perrentupa, she was a friend of Nelly Sechna, who had set up the NID's handloom department, the units, and they had both trained at Cranbrook. And Helena actually was then invited by Gira Sarabhai, who was involved with the NID, to come and establish the Indian textile design curriculum. Why I'm showing this particular image is because we've often reflected how these kinds of aesthetics of global modernism have been a very intrinsic part of that kind of design pedagogy, that of NID, a certain kind of international modernism, minimalism, and allude to geometrical designs, even though they're expressed in Indian handmade traditions. And often this is being attributed to the Scandinavian influence through Helena Perrentupa. So I'm showing you the work of a very influential and important Indian fashion design brand, Abraham and Thakur. And they were students, David Abraham and Rakesh Thakur, who established Abraham and Thakur, were actually students of NID and trained for several years under Helena Perrentupa. And it's interesting to then see how these kinds of aesthetics, I mean, this is an image from one of their new collections. And it's interesting to see how then those kinds of early thrusts, those aesthetic thrusts, actually have over several decades now, almost 4 decades, continue to shape important sort of occurrences in Indian textiles and fashion. I've spoken about some of these artists like Ritu and Nelly, who were sort of straddling the world of functional design, producing products, using traditional Indian hand techniques to produce contemporary products, but who also had an independent practice as artists. And perhaps the only exception to this sort of profile of textile makers during this period and from this generation is Manika Korea, who focused her work as a weaver and textile artist. So you see an image of her. She's a Bombay-based textile artist, works with the tapestry technique. And you see an early image of her here on the vertical loom on which she creates some of her tapestries. We have the next slide, please. And this is the kind of work that she does. And her role in sort of establishing that very conscious space of what is a textile and fiber artist in India is very important, because most other designers, most other artists tended to have that kind of profile of moving back and forth between product development and an independent artistic practice. Or in some cases, they were artists who were working across media, and textile was just one of the materials that they straddled in. So if we look at the next slide, please, we look at the work of Prabhakar Badri, who was an artist with the Weavers Service Studio Centers, and he just recently had a solo retrospective of his work at the NGMA in Delhi. And he was one of those artists for whom textile was one of the several media that he worked with. This is a work of his on silk. And if we have the next slide, please. Similar to the profile of, again, a very influential contemporary Indian artist and sculptor today, Mrinalini Mukherjee. She passed away a few years back, but her work, these massive sculptures that she makes with fiber, are a part of a larger artistic practice which includes drawings and etchings and ceramics and so on and so forth. So just to give you a sense of the kind of profiles of makers in India, on the one hand you had individual artists who had dedicated their work and practice to fiber and exploration in textile, like Manika Korea, where people like Nelly and Ritu, who were educators, who were themselves sort of experimenting between product and independent artistic practices. And then you have a profile of makers who actually use textiles among several other media for to express themselves in their artistic practice. The 50s to sort of 70s were a phase where there was a great fascination for what we call modernist, minimalist sort of aesthetics. And there was this, some scholars have suggested that because the colonial experience was so recent and heavy, that this idea of abstraction allowed India to sort of, in a very literal way, start from scratch. Allowed it aesthetically to sort of begin with a blank slate. But by the 80s, we see that artists are talking about how those ideas of geometry, those ideas of abstraction are actually inherent in, say, Indian tantricism, that they are a part of India's own historical sort of aesthetics. And there's a movement towards sort of looking at those kinds of ideas in abstraction in India's history. But at the same time, it's also a time that the decorative sort of comes back in a big way. And one of the main stimulus, of that kind of decorative, expression in Indian handmade textiles coming back was a 10-year-long series of interventions called Vishwakarma, which were exhibitions and documentation efforts to actually go in search of India's handmade traditions and to make them relevant, contemporary for a new market. They were facilitated, they were actually presented through a landmark series of cultural diplomacy initiatives called the Festivals of India, which from the early 80s to the early 90s projected the best of Indian culture and creativity at that time to the world. So when an exhibition through the Festivals of India like Vishwakarma, say for instance, traveled to America, to the United States, It traveled to 22 cities at once. It went to Japan, it went to several European countries, and and these exhibitions were also exhibited in India. So I'm showing you an early review of one of these Vishwakarma exhibitions. The first wave of those interventions actually looked at reviving excellence in craftsmanship, actually looking at historical museum pieces in India and to revive the level of craftsmanship and skill that was evident in them. And those kinds of interventions towards a mid and later phase of Vishwakarma led to actually experiments in contemporarization, in new ways of expression, in new repertoires of design, and so on and so forth. So Vishwakarma actually comes, we look back today, right at the middle of where we stand today between India's independence and now, and becomes a way to actually consolidate the several efforts that India sees in the immediate decades of post-independence, and sort of influences up till now what we receive as an inherited vocabulary, repertoire, success stories, resolution of handloom technologies that designers today have an access to. May we have the next? So this is from what I was talking about in early phase. So this is a panel made in Chanderi, where the idea was to actually look at replicating the best examples of traditional decorative Indian textiles. If we have a very important part of Vishwakarma was also, at this point when people who were involved with Vishwakarma went in search of traditional directories, of archives, there were none. There were almost none. The only records they could sort of refer to about India's handmade textiles were actually colonial period records. So this also became a very important exercise in mapping what was happening, where in connecting, historical information with the present, is a particular tradition still alive? If something was inventoried or mentioned as having a couple of hundred practitioners in the early 20th century, this was a chance to actually reflect if that number had grown or diminished, and so on and so forth. And an important part of this, like I mentioned earlier, was the creation of directories. So what you see here is an exceptional piece. Amrut Patel was one of the artists involved with the Weaver Service Centers, which was an implementing agency for the Vishwakarma series of exhibitions and interventions. And he actually went back to searching for floral motifs in miniature paintings in India. So what you see here is a collection of 108 motifs that we see in miniature paintings, which he then hand draws from start, and they are then converted into blocks. So many of the Vishwakarma textiles were also these directories that designers could refer to, which at once would give them a sense of what the tradition is. Very important aspect of Vishwakarma was the exploration of what happens to religious textiles. Most textiles in India, a lot of textiles in India, traditions in India are linked to religious purposes, to rituals, as offerings in temples and places of worship. So what happens in a new society that's birthing itself as a nation like India, and the relevance of these kinds of religious markers is decreasing, or the role of these kinds of formal religious practices and rituals is decreasing. So what you see here is actually one of the ways in which Vishwakarma posed this question or addressed it, which is, if you look at a pichwai, a traditional pichwai which is associated with the worship of Krishna in Nathdwara, in the form of Srinathji. And the pichwais were these sort of textiles which were always pichwai. They were literally towards the back of idols in temples. And the Vishwakarma interventions, one set of Vishwakarma interventions actually said, how about we remove the central religious icon and actually stay and work with and experiment with the aesthetics of the decorative aspect. So this pichwai and its revitalization was also a very, very important part of the Vishwakarma interventions, reflecting how India was changing as a society, how it was increasingly getting urban. And these kind of experiments started providing textiles which interior designers and people could use at home. So it also leads that kind of idea of of textile as art in a sort of very different way than the contemporary visual arts, gallery-oriented practices that we earlier spoke about in the profiles. May we have the next slide, please? Another fantastic aspect of Vishwakarma was that because they were implemented by the weaver service centers, of which there were so many, some of them were situated in places like Kanchipuram and Varanasi, where there were extant and historical traditions. But at the same time, they were also established in cities like Bombay, which traditionally did not have that much of handmade, manufacture of textiles. So some of these weaver service centers became, and it was a government network. So it also offered jobs to artists who were graduating from India's early art schools at a time that they did not have too many professional opportunities. And many of these artists, because it was a government transferable job, would move between, for instance, Varanasi to Bombay. For a few years in Bombay, they would then be in Calcutta. And through that, there was a lot of that kind of interesting creative exchange that started occurring. So Vishwakarma also produced what I often call that early phase of Indian contemporary textiles, where artists are just expressing themselves completely free of traditional repertoires of design, of motifs and techniques. So what you see here are literally brushstrokes, by artists at the Weaver Service Center in Bombay, of horses, of contemporary themes. And you see that kind of impetus and thrust also in the textile that we'll see next. That of these incredible, hand-painted animals. So technically, for instance, the brush strokes are in water first. The water kind of takes the shape, and then you put the pigment or the paint on top. So from today's perspectives, since we haven't seen that kind of innovation in painting on cloth, some of these pieces from 40 years back actually convey an incredible moment in India's textile history, where there was this kind of state-patronized and government-enabled experimentation possible. I'm going to then sort of start moving with these, expressions of the figurative to some of the contemporarization efforts which took place in the private sector. The textile that you see here was designed by historian Rahul Jain, who in the 1990s set up a workshop in Banaras to reproduce original 17th, 18th century historical textiles associated with Safavid Iran, with the Mughal court in India. So for 200 years, these textiles actually hadn't been produced in India. The technologies for them, the looms for them, the weaving techniques of them had completely disappeared. And some of these complex techniques that he started to work on reviving are called lampas and samiks. And while there was a lot of technical research that went into reviving these kinds of historical technologies of handloom production, what was also very interesting was there's a kind of subversion or reinterpretation or re-questioning or rethinking of the traditional motifs that these decorative palettes provided. So if we look at a little closer than with the next slide of this particular textile, you see a contemporary interpretation of the shikarga. Now, many of you may know that the shikarga is a very recurrent theme in Indian art, historical art. It shows scenes of the hunted animals. So you have these, animals being chased by hunters or by animals of prey like tigers and lions. And what Rahul Jain does is actually he replaces those kind of schemes of motifs and animals with those of endangered species of animals. So it's also interesting how there's this kind of re-questioning of what traditional repertoires of Indian design motifs are as well in interventions like this. Now, if we have the next slide, a similar kind of effort we see in the work of Bangalore-based artist, chintz artist Renuka Reddy. And what she did, like Mr. Jain did, spent about 10 years in she was fascinated by the chintz She was a textile designer working in the automobile industry in America, producing highly mechanized textiles that had nothing to do with the kind of textiles that she now produces. But she got interested in chintz, which were resist-dyed, hand-painted, hand-dyed textiles which were made historically in India and exported to the world, often called trade cloth in Indian textile vocabulary. And she actually went in search of the technique, of the materials, studied them intensely, and was able to almost replicate that process. Now it's interesting that, when Renuka Reddy does that, she's also taking forward a lot of sort of resolutions that were achieved in the Vishwakarma intervention. So, for instance, in chintz traditionally the background is always white, but the process of making it sort of colors it in a sort of muddy way, and the Vishwakarma interventions could not go back to the background in white, but Renuka Reddy was able to achieve that through her experiments. So it's very interesting how every phase sort of leads to another phase in India, and a very interesting part of this Indian sort of trajectory is continuities. It almost seems that every generation, every phase resolves something which is then added to. And I think this idea of continuity, I mean, the show is called Sutra Santati, because we're not talking about textiles being contemporary, which have emerged out of nowhere, no context. We're talking about textiles that have a very long life, that constantly improvise, that are innovating, amalgamating, adding, and sort of become a part of the collective consciousness and success of an entire ecology of makers. A similar experiment in revival, the word revival has become so used today, and I wanted to spend some time through the work of these practitioners reflecting on that word, because often it sort of is assumed to be a mere reproduction. But both in the case of Mr. Jain's work and Renuka Reddy's work, we see that there's something that they also reimagine. There's something that they're sort of adding in by way of composition. So it's not a mere reproduction. It's also sort of adding a certain layer to those interventions. It's a reimagination. It's a revitalization. It's a reaffirmation in many ways. And I think that I would urge all of us to really think about the word revival more carefully before we use it next. Bridget Singh in Jaipur represents a similar practice. She's a French artist who moves to Jaipur and discovers archives of extraordinary historical block prints that were not being produced in Jaipur at the time. We're talking 30-40 years back, and actually puts in a lot of effort. So between Mr. Jain producing the brocades in Banaras, traditionally the samits and lampas were not known to be produced in Banaras. So you have the emergence of a new tradition there. You have Renuka Reddy, who actually calls herself a chintz artist, very consciously, rather than a textile artist, because she's devoted so much of her time on understanding that technique. And you have the work of Bridget Singh in block printing of the same caliber, where there is a kind of reimagination of what is an extraordinarily historical and exciting repertoire of motifs and designs, which is introduced into clothing, into design for apparel, garments, as well as home furnishings. So, having sort of laid this kind of broad overview of how the state sort of becomes a very important player in the immediate decades of post-independence, I've tried to then talk about how private enterprise sort of takes over to some extent in setting benchmark of excellence and quality, moving into the profiles of some of these designers and artists. And since today's ecology is so much about fashion and how important handmade textiles are to the fashion ecology, I thought that in this fourth section, out of the 5 sections that I'm discussing today, we could also spend time on different Indian fashion designers and how they have looked at the idea of Indian handmade textiles and reimagined it. I want to be very clear that when we go to this exhibition, Sutra Santati next for the walkthrough, there are several practitioners there who I haven't talked about in my presentation, and I've been conscious in that. I felt that, there are, for instance, several master artisans, master craftspeople, master weavers in this exhibition. There are artists, there are designers, there are revivalists that I haven't included in my presentation because I felt that if I could talk about some of the people who are not represented in the exhibition, then between this presentation and the exhibition, you have a much broader sort of survey and overview of as many practitioners who are relevant and who have shaped the trajectory of Indian sort of post-independence histories. If we could just stay with the previous slide, please. Yeah. So, the sari always being handloom, being a traditional form of garment for occasional wear. And it was Satya Paul who comes up with this idea in the 80s of the cocktail sari. So a sari that you're not necessarily only wearing to a family occasion or something that is associated with a ritual, but that you can wear to a party much like a dress. So his earliest oeuvre, Satya Paul, a very, very important fashion house, also pioneering several business practices in the country that were ahead of its time. And I'm showing you an image of one of his, he devises this very interesting idea of a non-repeat hand-painted sari, which was on chiffon, on new materials like georgette, giving rise to this idea of a glamorous sari, which is akin to wearing a Western dress. And I think this is a very interesting moment. Often Satya Paul isn't a sort of is seen in many of these textile histories that we discussed, but he played a very important role in reimagining the sari, given that we'll all agree the sari continues to be such an important aspect of India's fashion and clothing cultures today, and how so much of effort today has gone among young generations of designers to actually work with it. So it's nice to be reminded of, a moment earlier where some very interesting, innovative experiments were also taking place in the sari. Next slide, please. The work of Tarun Tahiryani, often known as, combining a lot of kind of Western reference drapes into Indian couture and Indian bridal, a very well-known name, attributed to introducing new elements in Indian embroidery like Swarovski. Very interesting work which actually marries the use of drape, Western silhouettes into what is otherwise a very appropriate Indian ensemble for festive and for occasional and bridal wear in the country. Sabyasachi, I think all of us have heard of him. Somebody who then looks at this decorative history of Indian hand embroidered textiles, but alluding to Calcutta, where he comes from, to this idea of the vintage, to this idea of certain kind of colonial experiments which were married with Indian embroidery and Indian ways of making. Again, I would say somebody who has shaped a certain kind of sort of romantic view of the past, through his embroideries, the use of dull gold, certain kind of subdued colors, and this assertion of a kind of India's past in what is a very, very relevant and contemporary body of work today. The work of a textile designer called Chinar Faruqi, who has a brand called Injury, who works with jamdani and all kinds of very interesting hand-woven fabrics, producing a kind of aesthetic which is both at home in India but also global. So I think what also starts happening from the 90s, since the economy has opened up more, there's more travel, there's more exposure to global currents. A lot of the generation of artists that have generation of designers who have who have tried to explore this idea of what is Indianness, what is India, straddle this idea of textiles which are both at home in India and to the local market as well as to the global market, with huge sort of high-end retail presence across the world, including markets like Japan. The work of Rajesh Pratap Singh, who starts marrying elements from Western Western wear for men into women's wear, and sort of looking at questions of androgyny, questions of how that kind of Western idiom could be introduced into daily wear, into formal Western wear in the country, but using Indian textiles which are fairly unique, which have that kind of contemporary international flavor. Next, please. The work of Suket Dheer. So what you see here is actually a very interesting experiment in ikat. Normally you associate e-cutting with motifs and with certain kinds of patterns, but he takes the idea of ikat to create this kind of ombre effect in a collection that won him the International Woolmark Prize. Also, very interesting project where he experiments and introduces wool into the Andhra ecology of ikating, conventionally which uses cotton or silk. The work of 1111, a Delhi-based studio that actually took up this idea of khadi denim. So what you see here is actually a box in which a jacket like this that you buy from them is sent in, where it has all the ingredients that convey the process of the product's making. So what is also interesting with, if we could pause here with the work of designers like 1111, is this idea of natural dyes, of natural materials, the hand spun that sort of come into the picture, and how important that kind of expression and articulation has become in the Indian scheme of things today. The work of Alexander Calico, who is from Kerala, and starts, and experiments with very interesting handloom fabrics that take from traditional technology but express themselves as they could be from anywhere in the world or the country. The work of, very interesting movement that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years has been the work of studios and designers in the Northeast, in places like Ladakh, where Jigmet Couture is based. And this idea of going back to reviving, contemporizing elements of textiles that were a part of their culture into products that are of today. What is interesting about Jigmet Couture is that they produce a contemporary line, a line of clothing that can be that is more versatile, but they also they produce Ladakhi couture, they produce Ladakhi bridal wear that it continues to be relevant and used today in weddings in Ladakh. And then the work of designers like Kalol Datta, who also then start experimenting with new materials, start giving materials a kind of global aesthetic, but also through this idea of motifs and silhouettes which question gender. So just to give you a profile of the kind of aesthetic spectrum that exists in India today and the various ways in which textiles are being used very validly, very consciously in the expression of Indian fashion designers. And moving on to the next section, the concluding section, where I'm going to be provoking some questions. So if we could move on to the next slide about what it means to be Indian. So when you talk about an exhibition of Indian textiles, when I talk about researching Indian textiles, does it become important to also question what is Indian in that context today? And the works that I'm going to show, or the practices that I'm going to discuss here, in some ways unpack that idea. Beginning with the work, this is an artist's work. Artist is Andrew Ananda Google, who's a South African artist, but his ancestors left India as slaves as part of the textile trade between Africa, the historical textile trade between Africa and India. And as a young artist, he now looks back at that history by coming to India, questioning the idea of caste and so on and so forth. So actually, literally this idea of, when you talk about casting away, the huge role that caste continues to play in contemporary textiles, which is often not discussed. Would I call someone like Andrew Ananda with Indian ancestry, an Indian artist today, is he producing stuff that could qualify to be in a presentation or exhibition or discussion in Indian textiles? It's a question that I think we can have a discussion on. So many of these works are used as provocations for later discussion. They're not necessarily solutions to the question that I'm posing. Again, the work of Giora Aharoni, who's a New York-based architect, but with a great fascination for India and has referenced India and used materials of India often in his work. In this particular body of work, he actually takes pulkaris and superimposes on them embroideries. He's Jewish, and what he does is he imposes the image of the Jewish synagogue in Bombay onto this pulkari, and this idea of then encountering how do two cultures encounter each other, and a work like this which uses the base of what is traditional pulkari or bag in this case, which has a certain kind of meaning in a certain culture and context. What are the fine lines when artists engage with these kind of textiles? Do they leave their Indian identity? Do they acquire a new identity? These are the kind of questions that I'm hoping to provoke and ask through showing works like these. Staying with the question of vocabulary, the work of Ajit Das. He's originally he's Bengali, and is a textile dye, is a natural dye expert, and worked for several years at the Weaver Service Center, developing a very unique sort of oeuvre of work with natural dyes, and consciously calls himself a kalamkari artist. Now, conventionally, the title of a kalamkari artist is used for artists who are working in Andhra Pradesh, who are from generations and lineages of the kalamkari tradition. And the idea that he chooses to call himself a kalamkari artist, thousands of kilometers away in Calcutta, in what is clearly an urban studio practice, is interesting to also kind of start conveying the lucidity, the versatility of vocabulary and definitions that sort of come into play while defining the protagonists and the elements of this Indian textile history that we're talking about. The work of Ashdeen Lilaowala, whose work in contemporizing Parsi Gara of the Zoroastrian community that he himself comes from is very well known today in the contemporary fashion ecology. And to pause here about something that is completely indistinguishable today from an Indian identity, that of the Parsi Gara, actually having Chinese origins, because it was the Parsi traders in the 19th century who traveled to China and to other parts of Asia, bringing back Chinese embroideries, Chinese textiles, art which was from China, and how that amalgamated into the Saree now about 100 years back, more than 100 years back, giving rise to a new kind of identity. So something that's originally from China, which now becomes quintessentially Indian. This idea of Indian itself is very interesting in this context, because often we don't know the relationship between the origin of a tradition and where it ends up, and the several stages and phases of the in-between. The work of Neha Puridhir, which also forms the central image of the poster for this presentation today, who uses machine stitch shibori, which is a resist technique associated with Japan, but which is today practiced across Kutch and many other parts of India. So a technique which is originally Japanese but is produced in a very large quantity in this country, because we have the skills of hand tying, of being able to stitch, and of natural dyeing, which is very intrinsic to shibori. So how does something like shibori then become a part of the Indian repertoire? And what are the kind of, what is the nature of change and transformation which is taking place here? The work of Chandrasekhar Bheda with the weaver Mahinder Singh. Chandrasekhar Bheda is a textile artist who produces large public commissions, and Mahinder Singh is a dari weaver, and a collaboration that we commissioned for an earlier exhibition called Fracture with the Devi Art Foundation, where conventionally the loom is a rectangle, two-dimensional kind of frame, but what this project did was actually create a loom which was circular. So when the textile is woven like this, and it emerges from the loom, when it leaves the loom, it automatically has this kind of sculptural quality, which is then formalized in the shape that we see here. So when the dari sort of transforms itself into something sculptural, again, what is the nature of change that is taking place? Where do we position something like this within a discussion of Indian handmade textiles? What is the nature of change which is taking place here? the work of Rahul Mishra, a very well-known Indian designer who now shows at Paris Couture Week, where he uses traditional techniques and skills of hand embroiderers in India, but sculpts with them. He actually produces these extraordinary three-dimensional forms which take the shape of the body. So again, traditional techniques which are being transformed. At what point, does this depart from being Indian? At what point does it sort of affirms its Indianness? At what point is it transforming itself into something which is globally legible, and so on and so forth? The work of Rimzim Dadu, the question of material. We often talk about, quintessentially Indian materials and fibers that are conventionally used in Indian handmade textiles that define the Indian repertoire. But somebody like Rimzim Dadu, who uses all kinds of unconventional materials, from silicone yarn to metallic fibers to strips of leather, and actually hand weaves them to create these kinds of sarees. Again, what is the nature of kind of transformation which is taking place? These kinds of works also make us question when something sort of moves from a kind of functional realm into something which is more sculptural, and so on and so forth. I'm also going to show one more work of Rimzim to start concluding the presentation. Again, you see strips of leather which are then hand woven to simulate patterns that we see in Indian handlooms. But at what level is this India referenced? Given that it is designed and made in India, at what point it qualifies itself to be something which is non-Indian? And ultimately, what purpose do we serve when we ask these questions about, what is Indian about these Indian textiles? And to end the presentation with a similar work from the graphic design brand Play Clan, that actually uses street elements in digital printing to transform these stunning artworks into wearable clothes. Again, bringing into this discussion, at what point something like this is Indian, at what point something like this referenced Indian, but also at what point is something functional, and at what point does it become art, in this case wearable art. So I hope we can have a discussion about some of these things, because I feel that we're constantly kind of revising our own ideas about things, and with these set of images I wanted to provoke a discussion that hopefully will take us to questions about what is Indian about this history of Indian textiles that we just discussed. Thank you so much. Are there no questions?
Sutra Santati exhibition is a lot about revival, of many kinds of things, of techniques, of the kinds of material that people use, design. But this whole thing that you have presented is all about new creations. I'm not saying that they're sort of opposite to each other, but how are we going to make that, what we see in Sutra Santati actually, stay? Because a lot of it, to me, it appears that it's very, elaborate, an amount of time that you have to invest in making all of those things. So therefore, it becomes really quite expensive. It may become very expensive. And how will the market react to it, in terms of making it alive, to staying alive?
I think you have to ask the market. I think that, the fact that the practitioners have created what they have for an exhibition like this, all of them are successful practitioners that have dedicated clientele. And the fact that they're able to do this extraordinary work and invest time and effort and resources into it means that there's someone buying. So I think one of the things that the exhibition really does is it is a reflection of where Indian handmade textile making is today. And from what I understand, there's, even if it's in a niche quarter, I think there's definitely a market, and that market is increasing for such exceptional textiles. We have to remember that India is the last place in the world today, it's the last bastion where this kind of extraordinary handmade techniques have survived. So I think from that perspective, a lot of these techniques and traditions are also relevant to an international audience. Let's not ignore the fact that now that the world has a lot of NRIs that are buying Indian handmade textiles, and they are a huge market. So from what I understand, I think there's definitely a valid market. That market exists for this kind of expensive product. And I think because people are willing to invest in something like this, which could be the same as what they would in some cases buy, say, a work of art for, I think that it affirms the value that they can place on the handmade. So I personally think that there is a market for it, and because there's a market for it, we are seeing younger generations of designers, studios, master weavers, master artisans who are taking it forward into contemporary practice. So my understanding is that there is a market for it.
We have seen that a lot of international influences have influenced our textile traditions. We talked of Japanese tradition, we talked of Iranian tradition, we talked of European tradition. Now that they've influenced us, how is our tradition, how is our designing or fraternity in art in textile influencing the world, their own textiles? Is there exchange or what? What is happening today?
So, we know it's a very good question, and I think we know now sufficiently about Indian historical textiles, and we have evidence from, say, at least the 15th century to sort of the 18th, 19th century, that so much of what was being produced in India was for markets abroad. So whether it was the chins, whether different kinds of kalamkaris, whether it was the Kashmir shawl, which had a huge market in France, the muslin. I mean, we know for about 1,000 years that Indian cotton, until the Industrial Revolution, in the 18th century, was 80% of the world textiles. So I think historically there's enough research which has established that textiles from India were producing for the world, and that the influences and the conversations were both ways. I think not enough work has been done to actually map the influence of what is being made in India today and how it has inspired fashion or textiles in the world in the more recent or contemporary phase. I think one of the reasons is that a lot of what is being produced in India today for export doesn't get seen in India, because it is immediately exported, and the tag is put from some other country where the pieces are then assembled into a garment. So I think there's a lot of opacity in that process. A lot of stuff which is being made in India for export is not seen in India, it's not documented, it's not written about, so we don't know so much about it. A recent book written by anthropologist Philida J, I think it's called How India Influenced the World, talks about the role that India has played in influencing international fashion. So, right from how, aesthetics of Indian Maharajas influenced the West, to how Khadi has been taken up in Japan in a big way. So there are now occurrences of research which is helping us understand this Indian influence on the global ecology, but not enough research has done. There is a lot. I mean, you look at something like indigo, which has always been historically associated with India, and India is the largest producer of synthetic indigo. But not only that, India is the largest producer of denim in the world. So there are a lot of these things which are taking place. There is very high-end mechanized manufacturing of textiles, which is all geared towards the international trade. There are pockets in India which are producing organic cotton, which is of international certification and is being exported. So much of organic cotton that you buy in home furnishings, in bed sheets, in bed covers at a store abroad is actually from India. So there are these kinds of occurrences, but I don't think there's enough understanding of it because a lot of it is really opaque in a system where it is not acknowledged to be made from India. Only recently it is being acknowledged. So I think in the phase that I'm discussing, we need to do more research. It's a very important area and it's a huge gap. We need to do more work on understanding how India has influenced the more modern and contemporary trajectory of fashion.
My question arose because I was in Paris for a couple of years and I saw the fashion week in Paris, the fashion in Paris, and a lot of African influences have crept in the European market. And I was trying to observe, is India somehow there? But I didn't find much of that on the
Well, I think some of this, we have to also qualify what is influence, right? Because if one French designer does a collection which has churidar, but moves on to the sarong in the next collection, are we still going to talk about it as an enduring influence? I think some of this question also needs to be clarified in terms of what we understand influence to be. So, I mean, the paisley, for instance, it's a historical Indian reference. Today, internationally, often people don't even know that its origin is Indian, as a style of motive or patterning. So I think there's a lot of that kind of confusion about things that have originated in India. Just yesterday, I was delivering an online lecture and somebody talked about the real Madras checks, the check tradition. And wherever you go in the country and in South Asia, you have this tradition of the checkered lungi or the sarong, which is, it's everywhere. And we've still not done enough work to understand, how sort of whether it was something that was influenced by global aesthetics, whether there's something that generated in India, or it was a sort of result of that kind of result of a more syncretic process of design, collective process of design. Because these checks are used in India, the checks were exported to the West, the checks were exported to East Africa, for instance, they're called injiri there. But we still don't have enough understanding of what exactly was the dynamic. So I think therefore this, why I wanted to end with this idea is that because, we first need to qualify, what we mean by an Indian repertoire. We know that the Kashmir shawl today, we have historical references now that designs were being sent by France to be produced in Kashmir for the Kashmir shawl because France was the largest market for the French, for the Kashmir shawl. So is it an Indian tradition? Is it an Indo-French tradition? I think some of these questions are a bit amorphous right now and the explorations are nascent, but they're important to have. So, but sitting from India, I think as someone who's looking at what is being designed and produced in India today, which is really the purview of my interest, what is exciting to see is that often what we consider to be very straight-jacketed or assumed categories of what is traditional, what is contemporary, what is modern are actually are constantly interchanging. So my purview is more about studying what is happening in India today in the post-independence period. And I find that whatever has happened is very dynamic. And I think it makes us question this reception of Indian textiles as being largely traditional or conventional, because they're anything but that. So that's really what my interest is.
But is there a concept called contemporary Indian or not? Because they all juxtapose one on the other.
So I think that's a good question too. So for instance, in a lecture like this, I end up using words, where an artist chooses to call himself or herself a contemporary artist. I'm obliged to refer to them as contemporary artists. But it's in my own writing, the reason I talk about post-independence histories and not modern and contemporary histories of India is my own way of dealing with the problem. Internationally, people refer to this phase as post-colonial. What I talk about post-independence is referred internationally by scholars as post-colonial because they feel that it is a post-colonial, post-British colonial phase in India. So these vocabularies are, we haven't established, the Indian textile field of researchers hasn't really established yet what we refer to modern, what we refer to contemporary, and I am staying away from the use of those words, unless the practitioners themselves want to be represented that way. So when I did the MAG issue, for instance, I didn't call it contemporary histories. I called it, the title was called Cloth in India Towards Recent Histories of Indian Textiles. So I'm sort of constantly trying to stay away from those strict ways in which these genres are created, because we have to remember they borrow from art history. So because art history is divided into ancient, modern and contemporary and now post-contemporary, there's a tendency for Indian textile and design histories to be also viewed from that perspective. But I think we need to emerge our own vocabulary. So that's where I stay away from that. But when someone chooses to be represented as a contemporary artist, I'm obliged to do that. I think that also lends itself to, the reason I gave the example of Ajit Das's work is that anyone else, by way of a scholar, curator, would call him a contemporary artist or a natural dye expert. But he chooses to call himself a kalamkari artist, which is a very different profile than what we normally associate with a kalamkari artist, because a kalamkari artist would conventionally be from Andhra Pradesh, from an inherited legacy of the kalamkari tradition. So I think what is exciting is that, and I think my job is to present how these multiplicities exist. And it kind of goes back, Rege introduced me as a textile designer. I've certainly gone through a formal textile training, and I worked as a textile designer soon after graduating from the NID, but I'm now known as a curator. And that kind of definition also reflects in my own practice, because at what point is my curatorial work informed by that of a designer? At what point is my design work informed by that of a curator? Am I a researcher? So I think these kinds of, at this point where the field of post-independent history studies of textiles is so nascent in India, I think we are still grappling with some of this technology. And I think it will only be when a number of practitioners and researchers come up who are interested in this period that we can have enough of a debate. So I think, unfortunately, your question will remain a question, because I do not myself subscribe to those art historical methods of classification and definition. I completely avoid from that. I completely stay away from those.
Thank you very much.
Hello, ma'am. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Sorry, there's light here, so I can't see
it's
anything.
okay.
But
So I recently graduated from NIP, and I visited Calico Museum for when I was in the first year foundation batch. So from that moment, I decided to work with Indian textiles as a designer, as a textile designer. I wanted to work in the field of crafts. And when we were offered the craft documentation and the development project, we were supposed to work with patola as a craft. So when we were working with patola they used to make it on slanted looms, and now for the convenience of the craft, they make it on frame looms. They, in the Saurashtra and Rajkot region of the country, of the state, they produce it on frame looms. So the technique of making the craft has changed, but the production has increased. So what do you think is, as a textile designer, what do you think should have been done? People have, we wanted to start new clusters with slanted looms to revive the traditional practice of patola, but then there were no dyers to dye in natural dyes. And then the weavers who were ready to work with slanted looms did not know, vice versa. The weavers who agreed to work on slanted looms did not know how to dye, and the dyers who knew how to dye did not agree to weave it on a slanted loom. So how do you perceive that as a problem? Like, the technique, revival of the technique is important as the revival of textile, or it just evolves somewhere. Like the tradition of patola evolved itself to frame looms now. So what is your take on techniques changing? Like how Banaras brocades, for example, now they weave it on a jacquard loom with with jalas and all. There used to be looms which are not even documented. There has been, I have tried to read about how looms were and how looms are today. I have visited clusters and tried to see how the change is coming to the industry, like how is it okay to save the textile or saving the technique is as important. Like there's a constant debate in my own head which comes as a textile designer. What should I do? So what is your take? How did you perceive?
So, as a researcher, I have a neutral perspective on things, right? Because I'm observing things as they happen, and I don't necessarily have, I see everything that's happening as part of a history which is unraveling before us. And for me, it's important to understand where it's coming from and to understand it for what it is. So I don't think I particularly have a judgment of whether something is right or wrong, but I think that what your question really brings up is a great, is very important, because with this overemphasis on the buying of handmade textiles in India, which we've seen, the kind of communication of that handmade process is usually of a person sitting on a loom and painstakingly throwing shuttle. That image of this weaver sitting on a loom is so associated with our understanding of handmade that we forget that actually there are so many pre-loom processes or pre-weaving processes, right? So, it begins with the preparation of yarn. Every cluster traditionally had its own specificities regarding that. Right from how a reed is made and fixed on a loom, what is a loom, what time of the day you weave because it's cooler or hotter, and so on and so forth. What has happened increasingly that I observe in the 15-20 years that I have traveled through craft clusters and handloom clusters of India is that there isn't enough work going into the pre-weaving processes of these textiles. So, which includes hand spinning. I mean, you may get the design right or something, but if you don't get the yarn right, you have technically revived something or you've technically reproduced something, but it has no essence or spirit of the original. So I think what your question really highlights is that there is inevitable change, and we don't know much about the history of Indian handloom technology because not much research has been done on it. Very few people have actually address this area. So we don't know the kind of nature of evolution that has taken place in handloom technology in the country historically. But we are definitely seeing that in front of us today. And why people are choosing to work on those looms for a number of reasons. I mean, I was in Paitan recently, and because there are a very small number of just a few hundred weavers now doing the painstaking complementary weave, which is associated with Paitani, there has been a government program to introduce, metal looms, which were traditionally wooden. So everyone is using those looms because they're being given them free as part of, a certain kind of, government subsidy, and therefore they're using those kinds of looms. It's much more difficult to maintain wood. You have to polish it, you have to keep it up, you need a carpenter. It's much easier to just move into a metal frame loom which is painted and which will not rest for us for 10 years to come. But I think the important thing is to understand that the reproduction, revival, reimagination, whatever word that you use for it, of a particular weave or a particular tradition cannot be possible without reviving all levels, right? So if you're only reviving one aspect of it, it needs to be said. It needs to be said that, it is just about reviving the way the design is drawn, or just about reviving the use of the jala, which is the pre-jacquard technique, or it's about, reinserting the idea of the natural dyes. But we forget that, the yarn is procured. The yarn is first spun, and different handloom centers had their own requirements of yarn. Even today, the Karnataka Silk Board creates a particular kind of yarn for Kanchipuram, which is different from the kind of yarn it produces for Arni, which are both in Tamil Nadu, right? So it begins with the yarn, the twist of the yarn, whether it's 2-ply, 3-ply, whether it's single ply, whether it's untwisted, to then, how it's laid out, to then, how the yarn is dyed, to how it's put on a loom, mounted on a loom, the kind of patterning mechanism, dobby, jacquard, jala, then the kind of weaving techniques that are introduced in the process of making the cloth. In Banaras, I was told that traditionally, because it was largely single color or maximum 2 color with a little bit of color highlight, and this kind of predominant use of zari, it used to be beaten. There was a process called burnishing, a process called kundi or hundi, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting that. But basically it was burnished. So actually when it left the loom, there was a finishing process which flattened the textile in a certain way that gave it this kind of, this gorgeous reflective quality. Now that is not being done, the last I saw a textile that was burnished like this was perhaps 5 years back. It's certainly not like a common occurrence today. So when all of these pre-weaving and post-weaving processes die, in Kanchipuram, just 2 years back, I saw this incredible process of how the reed is created to fix the yarn, to insert the warp onto the loom. And it was done by just 2 or 3 people in Kanchipuram today. And it is so painstaking, it requires the kind of dexterity of hand that I've never seen before. And when I asked her, will you teach it to your child? She said, not on my, only on my dead body, because what she gets in the process of weaving in that entire price supply chain is nothing. But what she does is so significant. But, she gets so poorly paid that she's like, I'd rather break stones and build a road, So unless you revive that and give more money there, how are you going to then make sure that, and all of these processes introduce a certain kind of quality to a handmade product. So I often say, anything handmade is not as artisanal to me. Artisanal is when every process of its making reflects in the final quality of the product. And often you don't see that unless you've seen the whole process. To create a repeat like of this size on, say, a Baluchari Saree in Vishnupur requires a jacquard system of punch cards, which is the size of a small room, and it's all handmade, it's all hand affixed. So I think that what your question really points out is that there's a need to understand that, we cannot just address one aspect of the chain, of the system. And we often only do that, because we always address what is perhaps the easiest, what is easily, marketable, what is easy to communicate. But like I said, that as someone who observes this as a neutral researcher, my job often is to merely record or understand what is happening and why it's happening rather than have a judgment about it. Because all of these processes of shortcuts, long cuts, improvisation are an inherent process of any manufacturing field. So who am I to sort of to judge that? Okay.
Thank you. So we would be concluding this session because we also have to go to the gallery, else the museum will close at 6. So we need to do the final walkthrough with our curator and our speaker. Thank you very much to the audience for being so patient. And I think this was the most apt way to conclude this exhibition, more so because you have actually given us a glimpse of Indian textiles right from 1947 to now, and introducing artists, designers and their works which aren't actually exhibited in this exhibition. So thank you very much. I would now invite our members of the audience to kindly join us for a final walkthrough around the exhibition, because today is the last day and you must have visited the exhibition already. It's on the first floor. If not, my colleague Sudhir will facilitate. So have a great evening. Thank you.